The name of this class is Natural and Artificial Environment. It is supposed to be a philosophy topics course. But before we can jump into what the distinctions between these things are, how they impact humans, how we should treat them, and how we might want to reform or reorganize society such that we can cultivate a better environment for ourselves, we need to ask a basic question. What is philosophy? Does it have any value? How do we do it? So this is where we are going to start. Rather than jump right into the content, I think it would be helpful to provide some sort of context for the kind of class that this is going to be, what we're going to be engaged in, how we are going to think and reason about these topics and issues, and why all of this should matter to us in the first place. So this is where we are starting, with a basic introduction to the nature of philosophy itself by looking at one of the most influential philosophers in the history of the Western tradition, Plato. Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher who was the student of Socrates, who I'm sure you've heard of, the most paradigmatic philosopher, the archetypal example of the philosopher in our historical tradition. Plato wrote on a wide array of subjects, from ethics to politics, metaphysics to epistemology, and a bunch of problems and issues that lie in these fields. Now, I could give several lectures on the work that we are going to be looking at today. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out a lot of what I might offer a normal introductory class, and instead I'm going to focus on the elements of this piece, the allegory of the cave, that is relevant to, well, giving you an introduction to what philosophy is generally. So here's the game plan. I'm going to start by reading the piece, pausing here and there to add some sort of context, and then I will try to analyze the piece and connect it back to what is Plato saying about philosophy here? What are his arguments about its purpose and its value? And why are we starting with this piece? So, without further ado, this is the allegory of the cave, which is a small part of a larger work that Plato wrote, which is known as the Republic, a masterclass in political philosophy. The allegory of the cave. Socrates begins. Next, said I, compare our nature in respect of education and its lack to such an experience is this. Imagine this. People live under the earth in a cave-like dwelling. Stretching a long way up toward the daylight is its entrance, toward which the entire cave is gathered. The people have been in this dwelling since childhood, shackled by the legs and neck. Thus they stay in the same place so that there is only one thing for them to look at, whatever they encounter in front of their faces. But because they are shackled, they are unable to turn their heads around. A fire is behind them, and there is a wall between the fire and the prisoners, who are shackled looking at the back cave wall. Some light, of course, is allowed them, namely from this fire that casts its glow toward them from behind them, being above them and at some distance. Between the fire and those who are shackled, there runs a walkway at a certain height. Imagine that a low wall has been built at the length of the walkway, like the low curtain that puppeteers put up over which they show their puppets. Now imagine that all along this low wall, people are carrying all sorts of things that reach up higher than the wall. Statues and other carvings made of stone or wood, and many other artifacts that people have made. As you would expect, some are talking to each other as they walk along, and some are silent. So, Socrates is asking us to imagine a strange picture here. Imagine you have a bunch of people chained up in a cave, and they're chained in such a way that they can't really move, they can't turn their heads, Their heads are fixed on the back wall of the cave. Behind them, there is a fire at some distance. Between the fire and the prisoners, who can't see the fire because they're looking the opposite way, there are people walking along a wall holding up various statues and artifacts. So the image that Socrates is asking us to imagine is that these cave dwellers are looking at this back wall, there's a light behind them, and what they see on the wall ahead of them are just the shadows of these things that the people are carrying along the walkway behind them. Glaucon responds, "This is an unusual picture that you are presenting here, and these are unusual prisoners." And Socrates says something extremely significant. "They are very much like us humans," I responded. Keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this. This piece, the allegory of the cave, is supposed to represent for Plato what the nature and the purpose of philosophy is, and what our condition is like since we are humans living in a society, living in this physical world, in these bodies with psychological and physical limitations. Socrates says that these cave dwellers are very much like us. Just keep that in the back of your mind. What do you think, he asks? From the beginning, people like this have never managed, whether on their own or with the help of others, to see anything besides the shadows that are continually projected on the wall opposite them by the glow of the fire. How could it be otherwise, Glaucon asks, since they are forced to keep their heads immobile for their entire lives? And what do they see of the things that are being carried along behind them? Do they not see simply these, namely the shadows? Certainly, Glaucon says. Now, if they were able to say something about what they saw and to talk it over, Socrates replies, do you not think that they would regard that which they saw on the wall as beings? They would have to. And now what if this prison also had an echo reverberating off the wall in front of them, the one that they always and only look at? Whenever one of the people walking behind those in chains and carrying the things would make a sound, do you think the prisoners would imagine that the speaker were anyone other than the shadow passing in front of them? Nothing else, by Zeus. All in all, Socrates responds, those who were chained would consider nothing besides the shadows of the artifacts as the unhidden. That is, what is real, what is ultimately real to them, what makes up reality. That would absolutely have to be, Glaucon says. So now, Socrates replied, watch the process whereby the prisoners are set free from their chains, and along with that cured of their lack of insight. And likewise consider what kind of lack of insight must be if the following were to happen to those who were chained. Whenever any of them was unchained and was forced to stand up suddenly, to turn around, to walk, and to look up toward the light, in each case the person would be able to do this only with pain, and because of the flickering brightness would be unable to look at those things whose shadows he previously saw. So, we receive our first hint here at what the journey to knowledge is going to be like for us. This is a philosophy class. This is all about trying to get to the bottom of things. Plato says here, that is going to come with some pain and suffering. The truth can be uncomfortable. And when you are locked into a particular worldview, or ideology, or religion, you remain blind to those alternative perspectives that might give you a fuller understanding of the universe around you. So, when you start on your journey to truth, when you start questioning things, investigating reality, following the truth where it leads, it's not going to be a pleasant experience. It may hurt. It will hurt. And as we will see, this pain is something that humans try to prevent and they try to stay away from. Continuing on. If all this were to happen to the prisoner, what do you think he would say if someone were to inform him that what he saw before were mere trifles, but that now he was much nearer to beings, or much nearer to really understanding what's going on? And that as a consequence of now being turned toward what is more in being, he also saw more correctly. And if someone were then to show him any of the things that were passing by, and forced him to answer the question about what it was, these artifacts and statues that the people are carrying, don't you think he would be at a wit's end? And in addition would consider that what he previously saw with his own eyes was more unhidden than what was now being shown to him by someone else? Why, yes, absolutely. And if someone even forced him to look into the glare of the fire, would his eyes not hurt him? And would he not then turn away and flee back to that which he is capable of looking at? And would he not decide that what he could see before without any help was in fact clearer than what was now being shown to him? What Socrates is trying to get at here is that when we start reasoning and reflecting, really critically thinking about the world around us, what we are being shown, what we are being told, the education that we're given, it's all going to be very disturbing and confusing at first. Since we are conditioned into a particular way of seeing and understanding the world, a fuller understanding eludes us. And at first, trying to achieve a fuller understanding is not something that's going to be easy. We might want to escape back into the dream from which we came. We may want to push aside the contrary evidence, push aside the views that are contradictory with our worldview because, well, we don't completely understand them and they threaten our way of life. We might even say that what we knew before and what we could rely on was better. And so a natural response to being given information that is contradictory to what you believe and what you think you know is to be defensive and to turn away from it. Now, however, Socrates continues, if someone using force were to pull him who had been freed from his chains away from there, and to drag him up the cave's rough and steep ascent, and not to let go of him until he had dragged him out into the light of the sun, would not the one who had been dragged like this feel in the process pain and rage? Yes, I think he would. When we are given a perspective of the world that is contrary to our own, that is contradictory with our own, that does not make us feel good. If someone tries to drag us to the truth, get us to see things that are uncomfortable, even though they might be correct, our immediate response is not love and acceptance or seeing this as an opportunity for personal learning and growth. It's to get very emotional and it's to get defensive because this process hurts. Continuing on, and when this freed prisoner got into the sunlight, wouldn't his eyes be filled with the glare, the brightness? And wouldn't he thus be unable to see any of the things that are now revealed to him as the unhidden or true reality? Glaucon says he would not be able to do that at all, at least not right away. It would obviously take some time getting accustomed, I think, if it should be a matter of taking into one's eyes that which is up there outside the cave in the light of the sun. So, we have this prisoner. His whole life, he has looked at the shadows on the walls and he has thought that that is true reality. What he has come to understand about the shadows he thinks is really real. That's what's going on. But slowly, after he is unchained, after he is forced to look behind him and look at the fire and the people carrying the statues, he comes to realize that there's more to the world than he knew about before. And this makes him incredibly uneasy. And when he is dragged out of his dream, out of his false reality, what happens? Well, he's not really clearly able to look at or understand another point of view because he has been shaken to his core. The world has fallen out from under him because his complete understanding of reality is being changed. Socrates says his eyes would be filled with the glare or the brightness of the sun if he were dragged out of the cave. He wouldn't be able to see any of the things that are now revealed to him, at least not right away, because it would take some time getting accustomed. When we are conditioned into a particular perspective about the way reality works, about what's true, about what's right, about what's politically expedient, we cannot look through the world through another lens. Or if we do, it takes a lot of hard work. It takes time for our mind and our heart to adjust. It takes time for us to get accustomed to a new way of seeing and understanding things, and consequently a new way of being in the world. In this process of acclimatization, Socrates says, he would first and most easily be able to look at the shadows, and after that the images of people and the rest of things as they are reflected in water. Later, however, he would be able to view the things themselves, that is, what is actually there, instead of reflections. So what Socrates is outlining here, what Plato is outlining using Socrates as a character, as a vehicle to espouse this, is that when we are shown a new way of looking at the world around us, when we are given a new perspective, a new framework, it takes time to adjust to that. But moreover, when we start our journey to the truth, towards a fuller understanding of what's going on, we can't just leap there. Just as a baby has to learn to crawl first and then stand up and then walk and then run, our journey to the truth occurs in steps or phases that build on one another. The prisoner at first, because he is used to the darkness of the cave, can first only see the shadows of things on the ground. But then, as his eyes adjust, as he opens his mind more, then he can start to see the reflections of things in water. And then finally, only after a long, arduous process of his eyes adjusting, of his mind changing, of his heart changing, then he can look at the things themselves, the trees, the plants, the animals, etc. The same is with our understanding of the world, our journey to the truth. At first, we can only understand and accept crude models or approximations for how the world works. You were given all kinds of these when you were a child. Perhaps when you were younger, you asked your parents how babies came into the world. And they probably gave you a story like, well, when a mommy and a daddy love each other, they get married and then a baby forms in mommy's tummy. That is crudely correct. It's not completely correct, right? There's a lot of nuance missing. There are a lot of things missing from that story. But there's a thread that's correct. We do the same thing in the sciences. When we teach people physics, we teach them Newton's laws before we teach them quantum mechanics. Even though professors know that Newton's laws don't hold for all of the objects in our universe. They hold for macroscopic objects like tables and chairs and water bottles. But when we get into the quantum realm, the laws don't hold. Those things play by a different set of rules. And so as you go through your physics classes, you develop a fuller and fuller understanding, revising the story and the models and the approximations that you've been given. The same is true generally when we're trying to inquire into the nature of reality and what is true and what's going on. We need to start with simple stories or models that we can understand, and then slowly over time build on those and revise them and make them more nuanced. We do this through education, through experience, through reflection. And Socrates continues. Within the range of such things, the prisoner now, remember, is looking at the things themselves. He's able to actually look at trees, not just reflections. He's able to see brush and grass and animals. He might well contemplate what there is in the heavenly dome, that is, in the sky, in space. He would look upwards. And this dome itself, more easily during the night by looking at the light of the stars and the moon. More easily, that is to say, than by looking at the sun and its glare during the day. Certainly, Glaucon says. But I think that finally he would be in the condition to look at the sun itself. Not just at its reflection, whether in water or wherever else it might appear, but at the sun itself, as it is and of itself, and in the place proper to it, and to contemplate of what sort it is. Now, there are a lot of deep things that Plato is doing in this passage with regards to the sun. But we're just going to focus on what is expedient at this moment. We'll revisit a lot of the deeper, more complex ideas at the end of class. But what Plato is basically trying to say here is it takes time for us to learn and understand the world. It's a process, one that is painful, one that is not always comfortable. But when we have traveled far enough along that road, we're able to actually grasp the truth of things. We're able to actually understand what's going on. In these brief, lucid moments, we get some insight or some enlightenment. That is one thing that Plato is trying to get across here in this allegory. But it takes time to get there. And having done all that, he continues, by this time the prisoner would also be able to gather the following about the sun. That it is that which grants both the seasons and the years. It is that which governs whatever there is in the now visible region of sunlight. And that it is also the cause of all those things that the people dwelling in the cave have never before their eyes in some way or other. So, what does the prisoner do once he is able to ascertain reality? Well, he inquires further into the nature of it. What caused all of this to happen? Why is that thing separate from that thing? How did all of this get to be here? He utilizes his contemplative and imaginative capacities in order to reflect on the nature of things even deeper. And this is what Plato is trying to get us to do in this book, The Republic. He's trying to get us to see that reason and reflection is a necessity if we're going to come to a fuller understanding of the world. We need to think about things. We need to question and investigate and explore. We can't simply be content with what is shown to us or what is given to us. Because unless we investigate those things for ourselves, how can we know what is being told to us is true? Now there's more going on in this passage, obviously, but for now, that will do. And then what? If he again recalled his first dwelling, the cave, and the knowing that passes as the norm there, and the people with whom he once was chained, don't you think he would consider himself lucky because of the transformation that had happened, and by contrast feel sorry for them? Very much so. So when we come to a fuller understanding of reality, we look back on the things that we used to believe, and we should feel gratitude for the learning and growth that we were able to engage in. And if we think hard about where other people are at in their lives, we may want to share this information with them. We may want to help them grow and learn and transform as we have done, at least in the small ways that we are capable of. However, what if among the people in the previous dwelling place, the cave, certain honors and commendations were established for whomever most clearly catches sight of what passes by, and also best remembers which of them normally is brought by first? Which one later, and which ones at the same time? And what if there were honors for whoever could most easily foresee which one might come by next? Do you think the one who had gotten out of the cave would still envy those within the cave, and would want to compete with them who are esteemed and who have power? Or would not he or she much rather wish for the condition that Homer speaks of, namely, to live on the land above ground as the paid menial of another destitute peasant? Wouldn't he or she prefer to put up with absolutely anything else rather than associate with those opinions that hold in the cave and be that kind of human being? I think that he would prefer to endure everything rather than be that kind of human being, Glaucon says. And now, Socrates responds, consider this. If this person who had gotten out of the cave were to go back down again and sit in the same place as before, would he not find in that case, coming suddenly out of the sunlight, that his eyes were filled with darkness? Yes, very much so. Just imagine the situation. You've spent time outside for a whole day, it's very bright, and you come into a dark room with no lights. Are you able to see anything? Can you make out what's in that room? No, you can't. Your eyes haven't adjusted. And so, if someone comes to a fuller understanding of reality, they're not going to be able to revert back to their ignorant state. If someone goes through a personal transformation, they're not going to be able to live like they once lived. This is one of the things that Plato is trying to get at. Now, if once again, along with those who had remained shackled there, the freed person had to engage in the business of asserting and maintaining opinions about the shadows, while his eyes are still weak and before they have readjusted, an adjustment that would require a bit of time, would he not then be exposed to ridicule down there? And would they not let him know that he had gone up, but only in order to come back down into the cave with his eyes ruined? And thus it certainly does not pay to go up? What happens to the person who breaks out of the conditioning that they experienced, or breaks out of the worldview that they were fed when they were a child, or comes to a fuller understanding of reality? Well, oftentimes they're ridiculed by those who believe the things that they once believed. Imagine that you were raised Christian your whole life, and then in college you lost your faith and you no longer believed in God. If you were forced to go back to church and sing the hymns and talk about the stories and listen to the sermon, would you be able to do that successfully? Would you be able to mask your unbelief? Probably not. You are not conditioned to see the world in that particular way. You no longer buy into that worldview. And so, in that kind of social setting, it's harder for you to understand and play by the rules, to fit in, because you're not a part of that community really anymore. You don't see the world in the same way. You don't understand the world in the same way. Consequently, the people in that social setting might say, you went off and you got yourself indoctrinated, or you went off and you got yourself filled with useless or false information. And they might laugh at you, and they might say that you made a big mistake going off to college. But they might do something else as well, depending on the community and depending on the information that you try to bring back to them. If they can get a hold of this person who takes it in hand to free them from their chains and to lead them up, and if they could kill him, will they not actually kill him? They certainly will, Glaucon responds. if you change so intensely, if your worldview radically changes, others are not going to look too kindly on you for that, especially if they believe what you once believed. Our differing worldviews, our differing values cause us in some sense to be enemies with others, and for those people to be enemies with us. Rather than reflect on where we might be mistaken, on where our knowledge may be lacking, in those domains in which we may be closed-minded, we would rather destroy anything that would threaten the safety and security of the world that we have constructed for ourselves, the understanding that we have come to rely on. If you confront people with an uncomfortable enough truth, they may do violence to you. This is only one of the many lessons that Plato is trying to get us to take home here. This story is an allegory. An allegory is a story in which the aspects of that story are symbols for other things. In order to help explain some of the many things that Plato is trying to say here, I think it would be helpful to go through those symbols. So we have this story about prisoners in a cave who have a false understanding of reality. One is dragged out. It is painful. But after some time adjusting, after some reasoning and reflection, he's able to apprehend the truth of things. Consequently, he goes back down into the cave to share this news, to provide the cave dwellers with their freedom, with more information, and they end up ridiculing him and perhaps killing him. What is the cave in this story? Well, what's relevant to our interest today is that the cave represents life without philosophy and reflection. If you just consume all of the pieces of information that you're given every day without question, how can you know that what you believe is true? See, what Plato is trying to get at here is that we are all living in a cave. Or to put it perhaps more correctly, we are all living in multiple caves. Because we're not reflecting on what we're being told. We are not questioning what our professors tell us. We are not investigating the claims of scientists for ourselves. We're not exploring whether or not what the government and media and advertising is telling us is true. We are very much like the cave dwellers. Those who are simply accepting the shadows on the wall as what's real. And so the cave dwellers are us. They're normal people. They're people who don't reflect on what they're told or what they're taught. People who don't use their reasoning skills in order to come to a more holistic understanding of the world. I'm going to throw the word philosopher around a lot in this class. But what I mean by that word is not a professional philosopher like me who does this for a living. I don't mean Immanuel Kant or Aristotle or Hegel or Derrida or any of those people. In this class, when we're going to use the word philosopher, we're going to be talking about a lover of wisdom. Somebody who is seeking after the truth and following where it leads. That is what it truly means to be a philosopher. And so we are all going to try to aspire to be philosophers. Because by doing so, this will allow us to come to a fuller understanding of this stuff, to dig deep into these questions, and to hopefully obtain a fuller understanding of the universe for ourselves. The escapee, then, is the philosopher in this sense. One who is seeking after truth, who's trying to follow where it leads, using their reason, their reflection, their critical thinking skills. Now, there are multiple interpretations of what this allegory symbolizes. I'm going to provide a few for you. One that is historical, one that is political, and one that is relevant to why we are reading this piece at the start of this class. The first interpretation, history of philosophy, about Socrates, Plato's mentor. You'll know that his life story had something of a tragic end. Socrates was somebody who went around Athens trying to figure out how the world works. He asked people a lot of questions. Consequently, when he was able to use his reasoning and critical thinking skills to poke holes in people's arguments, they became confused. Maybe even some of them became lost and unhinged. Because if your understanding of the world is pulled out from under you, if what you are shown to believe in doesn't have a firm foundation, you would not feel too good about that. Well, according to the political authorities in Athens at the time, Socrates was doing just this. He was confusing the people. He was leading the youth astray. He was causing the youth to abandon the gods and abandon the traditions of ancient Greece and to go against the political authorities of his day. This is what the rulers charged Socrates with. They thought that he was a rabble-rouser, a troublemaker. And so they brought him into trial. They charged him with confusing the youth, with leading the youth astray, with undermining their authority. And ultimately, they found him guilty of these crimes. They sentenced him to death. And so the story goes, Socrates willingly drank the hemlock and died. So one way that you could interpret this story is that Plato is leveling an indictment against the city of Athens, against their political rulers, against their political system, against their priorities. Plato thinks, in some real sense, Athens is corrupt. Its rulers are lacking wisdom, and they killed Socrates, his mentor, his friend. What we might argue is one of the great sins in human history. So, one way that we might interpret this story is that Plato is trying to lay this great sin at the feet of Athens, charging them with this. For the story of the cave dweller mirrors that of Socrates. Somebody who apparently was able to escape illusion, but when he came back to the city, the cave, and tried to tell everybody about what he had learned, he was killed for it. Another way of interpreting this story is along political lines. Some historical context for you. Plato wrote this book, The Republic, in which the allegory of the cave is found, after Socrates' death. Well, before the book was written, the ancient Greek city-state of Athens was involved in a war with Sparta, known as the Peloponnesian War. Athens ended up losing the Peloponnesian War. And Plato thought that there were reasons for this. One of these reasons was that he thought that Athens had decided to organize themselves along democratic lines. One of the main themes that we see in the Republic is Plato's critique of democracy. He calls it mob rule. He thinks it is basically rule by the stupid people. And so he sees this loss in the Peloponnesian War as being a direct result of this poor form of political organization, the corruption that had crept into the city by these people who are not looking out for the public good, but who are looking out for themselves or to enrich themselves. This loss in the war was due to poor political rule and a way of life that is lacking in many respects. So, one way we could interpret this story is along political lines. What Plato is trying to say is Athens needs to get its stuff together. It is not currently organized and run politically in the appropriate ways. The proper people are not in charge. The proper laws are not in place. The proper things are not being done. Another interpretation we might bring up is educational. See, at the same time all of this was going on, these historical events, there was kind of an informal fight between the group of people that were called philosophers and a group of people known as the sophists. These two groups were very different. And if you ever read the works of Plato, you'll see that he doesn't have nice things to say about the sophists. Whereas philosophers were trying to understand the nature of reality and come to a fuller understanding of what's going on and why, the sophists were trying to make money. The philosophers never charged anybody for their conversations. They just went around trying to figure stuff out and talk to people. Whereas the sophists were charging young men who were going to get into politics in Athens, charging them to teach them how to use words in the right ways in order to persuade people and get what they want. So throughout this whole work, there is a tension between philosophy, the search for truth, and sophistry, the pursuit of wealth, of power, of things that don't really matter. Thus, we could say that this allegory is supposed to represent kind of an analysis of Athens' current educational scheme. Education isn't being done right. It's being ruled by these sophistic characters who aren't really teaching the young men of the city what's going on, but just how to use words in the right way. We might also say that Plato is arguing that merely trusting social convention is ignorant, and that if we are trying to educate a populace, the pursuit of truth should be the top priority. Not political power, not wealth, not land, but the pursuit of truth. There are two other interpretations that we will be discussing at the end of class, but I'd like to bring up one that is going to be most important for this class, and that is what I call the propaganda interpretation. If the cave is anything, we might say that the cave is the situation that we are in, being surrounded by all of these institutions, being parented in a particular way, being conditioned into a particular religion, being surrounded by advertising and government messaging, dogma, and ideology. One way that you could interpret this story, which is relevant to our class, is that brainwashing is everywhere and that we are all its victims. Whether it be advertising, CNN, Fox News, the U.S. government, the education that you're getting at the college that you're currently attending. All of these institutions, all of these things are presenting to you an imperfect picture of reality, an incomplete picture. When you really think about it, isn't parenting just glorified brainwashing? After all, your parents raised you in a particular way because they wanted you to have the same values that they have. They raised you to see the world in the same way that they see the world because they think that way of seeing the world is right. The government tries to get you to believe and do certain things because Well, that's required for a smooth society.
Okay, great. Hi, how are you feeling? I hope you're feeling better since Wednesday.
All of these institutions are engaged in producing a certain state of affairs so that society can keep functioning smoothly. Doesn't matter if it's parenting, advertising, or whatever it is. And so we should reflect critically on the messages that are being given to us. You should be reflecting critically on what I'm telling you right now. How do you know any of what I'm saying is true unless you actually think about it for yourself? How do you know that what the government says is good, is actually good, unless you investigate it yourself? You trust the proclamations of scientists and experts without looking into the evidence yourself. You trust what your education has given you. You trust what your parents have told you, what your church leaders have told you. But what Plato is trying to push us to realize is that if we really want to understand what's going on, we cannot be content with that. We can't just consume what is given to us and expect everything to work out hunky-dory. Really, what we should be doing is we should be looking into these things critically. We should be using our reasoning, using our reflection to work through this stuff on our own. So, we are reaching the end of the lecture here. I would like to just bring up a few more points. If you have thought through the things that I have just relayed to you, either before this class or after this lecture, or if you're doing it right now, there are 3 responses that you could have, at least 3 responses to this. You may want to become an activist. If you think this system, this way of thinking and being, all of that is not working out to your favor, if it's not serving you, you might try to change the world. If the world is causing you to have an incomplete picture of what's going on, if it's not looking out for you, if it's causing social and political problems, you might try to change it. Thus, one response that you could have to all this is, well, okay, I've realized the world is messed up. Let's change the world. There's another response that you could have, though. You could become an individualist. Instead of trying to change the world, you can change yourself so that you can better deal with what this world throws at you, with all of its norms and rules and perspectives and data. So you could try to change the world, or you could try to change yourself. Or there is a third way, and this is what I call the way of the relinquisher. This is kind of a perspective that is common in a lot of Eastern religions and schools of thought. Rather than trying to change the world or work on yourself so that you can better endure all of this and handle it, you might just let go of it all entirely. You might just go with the flow, give up your attachment to certain things, give up your desires for things, give up your preferences, give up trying to control anything that happens, and just ride the wave. This way of thinking is present in Christian quietism, as well as Taoism, and in some sense, Buddhism and Hinduism as well. But what are we supposed to take away from all this? Well, here are the basic ideas. There is a difference between reality and appearance. You see the world in a particular way. You feel particular ways about things. You're given pictures and stories and messages about how all this works. Those ideas, those images, are different from the way reality actually works. So, if your ideas, if your images, if you're going to rely on them, you should make sure that they conform one-to-one with reality, or else you're going to get into trouble. So there's a distinction between reality and appearance. What philosophy does is it tries to get us beyond the appearance towards actually understanding the nature of the universe. Second, there are caves everywhere. Your college is a cave. Religions are caves. Ideologies are caves. Any kind of political way of understanding the world, whether it's Marxism or socialism or anarchism or libertarianism or republicanism, these are caves. The institutions that we are a part of are in some sense caves, because none of these things by themselves can offer us a complete holistic understanding of reality. And we could go further than this. We might also say that the categories that we use to sort things in the world can prevent us from understanding reality. Terms, language, concepts, categories, these might all be caves as well. And so we shouldn't be content just to accept them. We should actually think about them and engage in a good deal of reflection. Third, we might say that knowledge is powerful but dangerous. Although humans have an innate desire to know, it is difficult to try to determine what to do with the knowledge that we acquire. Knowledge can get people killed. Knowledge, or you might say lack of knowledge, got Socrates killed. So, knowledge itself may not be good enough. We should spend some time thinking about what to do with the knowledge that we have obtained, how we might use that knowledge, how we might convey that knowledge to those around us. Because if we are not careful with what we know or what we say, bad things can happen. So, the fourth thing that we must take away is that we should be careful when talking to cave dwellers. Or in other words, you must be very careful when you speak with other people. We might say Socrates was not careful enough. He ended up getting killed for asking questions. In a sense, we are all cave dwellers. The reason why we are looking at this piece in this class is because I want to convince you that being a cave dweller is not something you should aspire to be. Being a cave dweller might be safe. It might leave you feeling secure. It might give you some amount of contentment. But if you have any aspirations about leaving a mark on the world, leaving a legacy behind, understanding what's going on, changing the world, changing yourself, you should aspire to be a philosopher. Because you can't do that stuff without knowledge. You can't do that stuff without some grasp on the truth of things. This is what philosophy is all about. In this class, we're going to try to get to the bottom of things. Undoubtedly, we are going to be left with more questions than answers. But that's okay. The pursuit of truth is a lifelong journey. When will you start?